Hey everyone, thank you for joining me today. Sorry for being a couple of minutes late. It's been a busy morning, as I'm sure it has been for all of you. I am delighted to be here today to talk a little bit about the stress brain and how we can work through the stress to rewire how we respond and think about it from the perspective of how we navigate our work, our life, and also help our teams in the process. So I'm Camilla. I run a business called 50/50, and for those of you I don't know, I'm really big on mental fitness. I'm a performance and sort of sales coach in those ways of sort of optimizing performance in order to help people live their best lives, generate their best work, and not burn out in the process. And a lot of the work we do at 50/50 is to optimize performance sustainably, thinking around stress, resilience, and all the interactions that we shouldn't have to sacrifice our well-being for in order to thrive at work. So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what goes on behind the scenes in our brain, but also we'll start with a bit around the burnout understanding. So with burnout, it's quite tricky because there isn't really a typical medical sort of diagnosis or approach to doing so. So it's not really a mental health condition. It's difficult to diagnose because it's not kind of on the list of a number of the different protocols that GPs would use in order to diagnose. And it can be kind of misunderstood with some symptoms kind of overlapping with sort of stress and anxiety. So I'll talk to you today about the World Health Organization view on it. We'll cover the different types of burnout that we see, and we'll talk around one of the tools I use, which is the stress curve, and sort of really understanding where we sit on that curve and what types of burnouts sit where. And then we'll look behind the scenes into our brain. So the World Health Organization, if I can get this to move on, there we go. Basically sees it as a massive workplace phenomenon. So they don't see it as something that could be to do with your life more generally outside of work. I feel that there's a bit of limitation here. I'm sure you might do too. But the feelings here of depletion, exhaustion, that mental distancing, which is often talked about, this is the way that it's perceived. Now, I think burnout can absolutely, and has in many of the instances where I've coached people or worked with different people through the journey of burnout, it doesn't necessarily have to be either or. It could be a combination of both. Equally, it can be, kind of brought on by external circumstances which impact us within the work, right? We all have stuff going on day to day. So when we think back to where we are from a stress state, it's really helpful to think of the scale of 0 to 10, and where we might sit on that scale. Because ultimately, we're never going to sit in the same place for a period of time that is indefinite. It's quite dynamic. The way that we look at our mental health, for example, is very dynamic. Our mental fitness, just like our physical fitness, is very dynamic and it moves around. And so therefore our levels of stress will also replicate that. So if we think about 0 to 10, with 0 being what we would refer to as sort of that very low motivation, 0 energy, and sort of, low stress, and 10 being the point at which beyond that we would enter into burnout. So the healthy zone would be anywhere between 3 and 7. And when we're thinking about this, and we can have a little look at this kind of, I guess, almost scale as we look through, we want to be thinking about where that pressure tips a little bit too far, because that's when we kind of start to recognize that stress is beginning to take a hold of us. Now, we all need a little bit of stress, right? Stress motivates us, it excites us, it creates energy, and we want to do things with a little element of stress behind us. But we don't want it to move into a space of draining or straining us and pulling us back more than it's moving us forward. So this is a helpful visual to think about where burnout might be. And I would say if we're thinking about stress becoming a bit too much, anywhere from 7.5, maybe around 8 up to 10 is an area of high stress. And that would be something we need to start checking in on if we can see that being the case for ourselves quite a lot of the time. Now, when we hang out in a high stress space for too long, that is when our elastic band is beginning to stretch. Excuse me. Our elastic band begins to stretch just that little bit too much. We become quite brittle. We become quite, tense and pulled, literally pulled to a point where we may snap. And that is the reality, what would happen when we enter what we would call a chronic stress phase. So being in a high stress zone for a small amount of time is okay. As I said before, we all have life going on. We all have stuff happening. However, it's when it's there for a long period of time and we're not bouncing back, we're not allowing time to recalibrate or to sort of feel the benefit of restoring ourselves through a period of lower stress interaction with our body. If we think about this from the typical bell curve, where we look at the bore out to burnout journey, this is about understanding what types of burnout we have. Now, many people really have heard probably only of the type of burnout that is what we all kind of see in the media, which is working every hour, push, push, push. And that would be what we would refer to as the frenetic style of burnout. So frenetic burnout is where it's the doing all the time. It's not necessarily always the way for everyone, but it's effectively, if you wanted to like personalize it, it would be the overloader. We're basically thinking here along the scale, when we're at the top here, we're kind of hanging out after the top end of the curve. Burnout kicks in when you would fall off the cliff. It's kind of a big shift from hanging out in potentially a habitual burnout cycle, but actually hitting burnout can be when we move beyond the scale of 0 to 10. So these are the high performers that keep going, like every signal in their body is probably telling them or telling you to stop, to recalibrate, to kind of relax. You're thriving on adrenaline. You're all about the deadlines, the doing. There's kind of an addiction tendency here to work, to your laptop, to checking your phone. And there are some unhealthy and toxic habits that will likely creep into your life when you're in this space. Oddly and paradoxically, we're getting all the praise because we're doing it, and we're doing it really well until we're not. And that's when the balls start to drop, the mistakes begin to happen. But high performers can hide this really, really well. And if you're used to operating in a very, very frenetic space and a high burnout space, then that potentially could very much mask how it comes across. And common things you might say here would be, I'll rest in a month. I've just got to get through this next phase, or it might be about the particular quarter at work. I've just got to get through this, or we've just got to get performance reviews finished, or we're just going through all the pay reviews and the bonuses. Once we get there, I'll rest. But I guarantee you don't rest once that happens. So that dopamine-driven behavior, that's when your stress system is becoming your performance system. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, and this isn't always widely known, we have something called bore out or under-challenged burnout. And this is where we are really not feeling motivated at all. And this is that whole place about you actually feel stuck, unwilling to sort of, get up and get out because you just don't have that underlying motivation or interest in what you're doing day to day. And that could be very much around the concept of doing repetitive or mundane tasks, or being really underutilized in your potential. So really not feeling that. So if you've got someone in your team that you sense is in that space, it might be worth having a think about the type of work that they're doing. And really they might be saying, I just don't care anymore. You might get that energy from them, and it just like lost all will to live, to be honest, with regards to that. And they just don't want to do that task. So there we have an underactivation of dopamine, and that progress and reward loop aren't happening. So very much a type of burnout in its own right. And then we have the values clash, which is something that we would refer to as sort of the moral injury burnout. And I think I went through this when I worked in corporate. I worked in a large corporate, and it got to a place where I just didn't feel in alignment with who I was. The tasks I was being asked to do, the work that I was experiencing, I was like, oh, it's not sitting right with me. So it's when you feel that clash, and it's that type of burnout that comes from, you know, genuinely just something deep down in your in your gut. Sorry, I've got a real frog in my throat today. Like you find it deep down in your gut where you kind of, it's just like an internal conflict trigger. Like you're just not feeling that this sits right with you, and that's the type of language that you'll hear yourself or someone else say, which is, you know, your brain is effectively sat there thinking, this doesn't feel right for me. I don't feel like I want to do this anymore, or it's not aligned to my values. But your brain sees this trigger as the same way it sees a threat. So it's seeing it as something that's not safe, and therefore we're kind of kicked into a stress zone. So burnout isn't one thing. We know that we've got the stress curve. We need to think about, of course, on this particular slide here, we are talking optimal performance as well, and then diminishing returns thereafter. But for the purpose of today, we're just thinking really about the scale of 0 to 10, where you're sitting, and have a think about where you do sit on the scale here as well. So burnout in its own right isn't just the typical frenetic. We also know that we can have bore-out and moral injury. So just recapping there. And yeah, which one feels more familiar to you? Have a think about that. So let's look inside the stress brain. So I'm going to use an analogy. I'm going to use an analogy of a smoke alarm. That's because basically I think it's the easiest way for me to explain what can be quite complex neuroscience from behind the scenes. But actually, if you think about your brain as your internal smoke alarm, scanning for threat at any given time, it's a good way to sort of kind of capture it and then almost re-explain it. And it's great to re-explain to other people as well when you're kind of, you know, going through the understanding of this area. So within really quickly, within a tenth of a second or even less, the brain is assessing threats. It's wired to do this from back in the day when we were all cave people. And before you even realize, it's already decided if something is a threat or if it's not a threat. And this alarm in our head lives in a part of the brain called the amygdala, and this is what we'll refer to as the brain's threat detector. So when it senses this danger, when we are in a space of like real threats, it's going to send a warning message, an SOS, to a part of the brain called the hypothalamus. Now, this you can review and you can think about it as almost your command and control center. So this is the bit that we use to excuse me. So the hypothalamus is the bit that will kind of send out those controls and those commands for us to do. And when we hit the red button on this stress zone, we've got the alarm going off in our brain. And now this triggers the HPA axis. So this is the feedback loop that we have between brain and body. So the kinds of systems that we've got going on in our body talk to one another. So obviously we have these physical reactions. So all of a sudden we've got this release from the hypothalamus, which is where we've got all the kind of chemicals releasing through the body. And that heart rate will increase. We will see the flushing of our cheeks. We'll feel the tension in our shoulders. We'll feel the heart rate beat will increase, but also our blood pressure will spike. And also in these moments, our focus completely narrows. So we've got to this space where we are thoroughly thinking about, you know, oh my goodness, we've got all this adrenaline and cortisol in our body, flooding our body with this reaction, and our physical signs are now reacting to this smoke alarm that's gone off inside our head. So while that alarm is like blaring, our prefrontal cortex, sort of our rational, problem-solving, intellectual brain, that's gone offline. Straight away, we haven't even got an awareness that it's kind of almost automatic. It's almost done. We're just straight away, it's offline. We don't know how, we don't even know what's happening really. We just know that we have a major threat kicking in to our system. So the part of our brain, which is called the hippocampus, and that's the bit that looks after our memories. It's almost like our hard drive of all the things that we've done before. It's our memory, it's all our learning. And that should normally step in a stress space and say, you know, it's okay, it's nothing too serious. You know, if we're thinking about the analogy of a stress of a smoke alarm, it might be, oh, it's just some toast burning, it's fine, let's turn it off, nothing to worry about. But when we're under stress and we have adrenaline and cortisol flooding through our body, we are not able to do that because effectively our hippocampus shrinks. So our ability to do that diminishes. So all of a sudden we're losing perspective and we're losing memory. So we're not acting in a rational way. We're not thinking intellectually. We're in quite a primitive mental space where we are likely to be in fight, flight, freeze zone. So that is why you'll probably be thinking, when I'm stressed, I forget things, or when I'm stressed, you know, I overreact, or I spend a lot of time wondering, why did I say that? Or why did I do that in that particular moment? Because that's your amygdala hijacking your whole brain to create reactions that try to keep you safe, but aren't actually serving you in the moment. So I think we've all been there when we've sent a regrettable email or something like that, haven't we? So with chronic stress, if we think about it, chronic stress is when we are in a space of high stress for a very long period of time. But if we have this alarm fatigue, where we're continually putting ourselves in a place where the alarm is sounding, we're constantly in a space where we're flooding our body with cortisol, with adrenaline, our, you know, our ability to remember, the memory, the learning, all of that is shrinking, and we're not using it to help us move through logically anything that we're experiencing, then this is going to begin to show up in how we react in a working environment as well. So imagine the system's going to keep firing every day with your Microsoft Team pings, with your Slack chats, with that 2 a.m. email, with that pressing presentation, with the meeting with the CEO. Every single time, your hypothalamus is releasing cortisol into the system, and it never ever gets a chance to reset. And this is why people hang out in high stress spaces. You had to forgive me. I've had a recent bout of I've had a recent chest infection, so it's still quite hard for me to talk without a small cough. So I hope it's not putting you off, but hopefully you can kind of listen through the coughs and understand what I'm saying. So the hippocampus is getting tired. It's kind of fatiguing. The amygdala is almost like, imagine it like an oversensitive teenager reacting to everything very immediately. And then the prefrontal cortex is no longer in control in the way that we would want it to be. So that is effectively how burnout works within the brain. And it's really important to see it that way, because it helps us to understand that actually it's the alarm going off. And if we think about in our own homes, we would never just walk out with the alarm sounding, would we? We would do something to stop the alarm, whether we rip the batteries out or rewire it because it's a wiring issue. We do something to stop it. And that's what we need to do when it comes to thinking about our own brains and our own stress responses. So one of the tools that we talk about here during the REWIRE program is the 90-second reset. Now, this is Jill Bolt Taylor's 90-second rule, effectively, and you might have heard of her. She's an American neuroscientist. It's a principle that states that the body's sort of physiological reaction to a trigger, to a stress moment, to an emotion, actually only lasts about 90 seconds before the chemicals that it creates are fully flushed throughout the body. They're literally in and out within 90 seconds. And she's done so much research and sort of looked at this area for such a long time. It's really heartwarming, actually, to know that we have ultimate control of how we feel and how we show up, especially when it comes to stress. We often think that with this hijacking of the brain, we feel like we're shackled or we're tied to our emotions and to our stress levels. But actually, the reality is that we have a way to rewire. And that's because our thoughts and our thinking are distinct. So what we think is a fact, you know, around something actually happened, It may well be a fact, it may not be, it might just be a thought, but the thinking is the story that goes alongside this. And then that kind of context will help us understand this almost reset that we can do whenever we want and however we want. So think about an initial trigger that we might have. Something's going on, something's happened at work, someone's kicked off in the team, whatever it might be, it's triggering a stress response in you. Now that particular event is going to release a load of chemicals throughout your brain, as we know. And that will be like noradrenaline, and that causes a physical reaction, as we've touched on. So we know from the body that that is happening. Now, that event, as we now know, lasts no more than 90 seconds. And then we have a choice. Once that 90 seconds is completely up, we have a choice. Do we want to move on from that moment and let that emotion pass? Or do we want to continue the emotional loop by replaying it like a record in our brain over and over and over again? And that is the reality why most of us suffer with our well-being as well, because we don't understand how to intervene and to interject, to stop the thinking that perpetuates the suffering, or in this case, the stress. So when we're upset and overthinking an email that we've sent, or perhaps a conversation we've had with a loved one, it's the thinking that causes the upset, not the actual body. The body's done with it. It's flushed it, it's processed it, it's moved on. But the brain is a little bit behind. So how do we apply the 90-second reset? So first of all, we need to name it to tame it. So we want to recognize the emotion. And this is about becoming aware when a really strong emotion, like anger, fear, frustration, that anxiety arises. We want to know what it is, we want to name it, and we want to be really clear about it. And then we know it's going to take 90 seconds, so this is our pause. And we need 90 seconds to reset. Now, a really good thing to interject here is a bit of breathing. So you want to focus your breath during this time, and you want to have 2 feet on the floor, and you want to be taking breaths where your exhale is longer than your inhale. Now, there's also something called a physiological sigh, and it's used a lot with high-performing athletes and with NASA, and it's really done as a way to signal to the brain that you are safe, which is ultimately what we need to do with any breath work. It engages the parasympathetic nervous system, and it helps us to feel relaxed and calm, and tells the brain all is okay, we can continue without being in fight, flight, freeze mode. So to interject here, and just to give you an additional tool, the physiological sigh is where we either take a deep breath in through the nose, and then as we've inhaled through the nose, we're going to do another short, sharp inhale thereafter right at the end. So it's like this. And then we want to exhale as long as we possibly can. So you want to always be exhaling longer than your inhale. So you're coming out. You do that a couple of times, you are going to send that message into your brain. I was going to say into your team then. Send that message to your team, into your brain to make that work. So once you've had that break and allowed that initial chemical reaction to subside, you've done your breath work, then you make a conscious choice. Your next step must be intentional. So this is about really thinking that you're in a calmer state. Now you're being a little bit more pragmatic about it. You can then decide, am I going to engage with this particular emotion anymore? Do I want to have more upset, anger, frustration? Or am I going to make an intentional step away and be sort of responsive rather than reactive? And this, my friends, is a really great way to interrupt stress, reset, and give ourselves the grounding that we need to pull ourselves back in order to move forward without so much stress clouding us. So you've heard about the World Health Organization's definition of burnout, and that it might be limited, depends on where you come from on your standpoint. My view is that there is more to burnout than just it being an occupational phenomenon. However, it does happen in certain types of work environments, and the number one cause of burnout actually is toxic workplaces. So we know we have more than just the typical frenetic media popular version of burnout, with that addicted to work energy and that push, push, push. We also have bore out, and we have the moral injury burnout. We understand the stress scale, where burnout sits, where bore out sits, where healthy zones of stress lie, and what happens when we hang out too much. We know what goes on inside the brain. We've got the analogy of the smoke alarm, the way that the different parts of the brain react, the way we shut down our intellectual capabilities when we're in stress, and our ability to be logical, innovative, creative, design new ideas, overcome roadblocks, all of that goes out of the window. None of that is possible when we are in a place of high stress. So then we're in a place where we're trying to get the support from the other part of the brain, but the competence and the capability of that is shutting down. So we can't rely on memory or learning from the past either. So what we need to do is to interrupt the state, change the state, and get ourselves into a space where we recognize that the feelings that we're going through will not last forever. We can interrupt with the 90-second reset, and we absolutely can wake up the parasympathetic nervous system to recognize we are safe with breath work. So using all of this together and being aware of it will help us to make a conscious choice. Now, I would love to talk more to you about the programs that we run here at 50/50. If you scan the code on the left-hand side of the screen, you will see it will link to a short form where you can kind of just pop down what type of company you work in and what you're doing at the moment and what your role is, and whether you'd like to book a call with me. We can talk through lots of different ways that we can partner. And equally, I'd love your feedback. It'd be great to hear some feedback from you on today's session. So the other QR code will give you the opportunity. Please connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm Camilla Rogers. I'm also the Burnout Coach on TikTok. So if you're on that platform, you can follow me and get lots of useful support. And yeah, thank you so much for joining me today. Sorry for the frog in my throat, but I think we got through it. I think we got through it in a way which I hope has elevated the understanding and given you a whistle-stop overview into a high-level understanding of the neuroscience behind stress and why sometimes we can't always think our way out of burnout. Thank you so much, and I hope to see you at the next session. Bye then.